And so, yes.
We have one more question.
Yes.
You mentioned that pure consciousness has been referred to in many traditions and civilizations. Did any of them develop this knowledge in the way that the Vedic tradition did?
I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that.
Sorry. So you mentioned that pure consciousness has been referred to many traditions and civilizations. Did any of them develop pure consciousness in the same way that the Vedic tradition did?
Let me see if I understood you correctly. Are there any other traditions that describe pure consciousness in exactly the same way the Vedic tradition did? Okay.
Develop the knowledge of pure consciousness, or did they kind of systematize it to any extent, or make it available to a lot of people?
Something beyond just an experience. Did they actually put it part of an epistemology, a structure of knowledge? Or did they just refer to that experience?
Well, I would, and if I'm not answering your question correctly, just remind me, but there are many, many people in the West who have described pure consciousness in exactly the same way it's described in the Vedic tradition. It has no objective sensory qualities and no change, no finitude, just unbounded, infinite consciousness. And that experience that throughout the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras and the Yoga Sutras and all that good literature, it's vast literature. And that's what the first volume in the series is about, the Vedic tradition, and a Vedic tradition and the Greek tradition. And I show that the Greek tradition describes pure consciousness in exactly the same way that the Vedic tradition did, using those criteria: unbounded, infinite, eternal bliss, self-knowing. And that's an experience that is, I mean, it's like when I had my experience, I thought, has anybody ever experienced this? And so I was totally delighted and surprised to find that some people had, and that it turns out to be the mainstream of our Western tradition. And it's exactly the same as it's described. First, I discovered it in the Eastern tradition and then in the Western tradition. And it is very, very basic to both. And it's described in the same way. And I tried using, that 108 qualities of pure consciousness. I tried to use that to give an objective criteria so we could have an evidence-based, criteria-based inquiry into the universal nature of pure consciousness. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think the question is taking it the next step. So people have had the experience of pure consciousness. Has that been the core of a body of knowledge, a structure of knowledge that they brought out? I think that's the nature of the question.
So I'm sorry to have to ask everybody to repeat, but
I think the question is, have they taken that experience and used that to build an epistemology, a body of knowledge to understand their culture and so on?
Yeah, well, it's kind of hard to, it's a very good question, because in the West, people are very leery of experience, like Christianity, based solely on book, not experience. You can't have experience. You can't talk about experience. People who tried to talk about experience of God beheaded, burned at stake, and so on. Well, that's the extreme case. But the West feels more comfortable with book knowledge than with experience. But when you look at the whole history of civilization, from the Rig Veda to the present, you've got hundreds of men and women who have described the experience of the same pure consciousness as defined by those criteria, those properties. They're all non-sensory properties, by the way, but they're properties that they're very vividly experienced. You can vividly experience silent, unchanging bliss just as much as you can experience changing red and blue shapes. I mean, the sensory qualities are not the only kind of experience we can have. We can experience abstract, oneness, universal. And that's an experience that's just as much or more of a life-changing experience than anything you can experience in the relative. And so once we understand what defines that experience, I can show you it's pervading the history of Western and Eastern civilization and ancient traditional cultures and everywhere in the East and West. So anyway, that's, I think that getting really clear about the criteria for identifying pure consciousness is a first step. Now, I don't know if this is the best way to do it, but at least you've got some kind of a list of criteria. And then what I can show is that everybody's describing a subset of that, or using a subset of those terms to describe an experience. And they say they have had an experience. So yes, experience is important. And that's why, when I started out, the 5 criteria that Marcia gives complete knowledge, the first is experience, direct experience. And that's basic. And we've talked a lot about Marcy's he's talked a lot about experience, but it's not his experience that makes it true. It's the fact that this domain of pure consciousness has been experienced by hundreds of people, East and West, and in all cultures, that makes it a source of universal, well-grounded knowledge. As much as the sensory experience that scientists appeal to makes science a source of knowledge. Experimental science is based on experience also, but sensory experience, there's a different kind of experience than sensory experience. That's the experience of transcendental consciousness, which has no sensory qualities. That's one of its defining features, but that scares people. They can't imagine if you don't have some sensory quality. Hume says this in his book. If I were to take away all my sensory experience, I would cease to exist. He thinks he would cease to exist. But all the people who had the experience didn't cease to exist. They experienced unbounded, eternal bliss, unchanging, silent bliss. And that experience is what makes it unique and different from all sensory experience. So there are 2 kinds of experience we have to look at. Sensory experience, the foundation of science, and the experience of eternal, unchanging, unbounded bliss. Now, Aristotle is interesting because Aristotle knew both methods. In fact, Aristotle was the first to apply the method of sensory perception to explain it as a method of knowledge. And he distinguished 2 methods, sensory perception on the one hand, and the experience of eternal, unbounded, unchanging, self-knowing consciousness on the other. Now, who was the first greatest scientist in the West? Aristotle was the first to discover that the earth is round. And he was the first to give evidence that the earth is round. And the round earth, he said, well, one way we know is that only a round object always makes a round shadow, and the shadow of the moon on the earth on the moon is always round. So that proves that the earth is round. Now, people didn't believe him for 2,000 years until Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama went around the world and circumnavigated the whole thing and said, yeah, it is round. But he's the first great scientist of an empirical scientist. And he was the first to very clearly lay out the method, settle the activity of the mind, and experience that unbounded, simple, unchanging, eternal, self-knowing, pure bliss. So he had both. And Marcy's saying we can have both today and we can get them together. And that integrated approach of modern science and Vedic science is the foundation of complete knowledge.